A brother and sister set out on an overnight kayaking trip into the Louisiana marshes and were never seen again. For 7 years, their disappearance remained a painful local mystery, with the search yielding only their 2 kayaks found miles apart. Then an impossible signal flared to life from their satellite beacon, pinging from a remote location hundreds of miles out in the Gulf of Mexico and proving their disappearance was never just a simple accident. The humidity was a physical weight at the boat launch, thick and unmoving in the early morning air of August 15, 2012. Preston Keegan stood by his truck, checking his phone again, though he knew the reception in this part of the Louisiana coastal marshes was notoriously unreliable. His children, 21-year-old Odelia and 18-year-old Tanner, were supposed to be waiting for him. They had planned to break camp at dawn and paddle back to this rendezvous point by 8 a.m. It was now past 10 a.m., and the only movement on the murky brown-green water was the lazy drift of cypress knees and the occasional ripple of a jumping mullet. This trip was meant to be a celebration. Odelia had spent the previous 6 months recovering from a complicated knee surgery, a tedious process that had confined her during the peak of summer. She and Tanner, inseparable despite the 3-year age gap, had planned this overnight kayaking and fishing excursion for weeks. It was a ritual for them, something they had done countless times in the intricate waterways that spiderwebbed across the Louisiana coast. This time it was symbolic, a return to mobility, a reclaiming of the outdoors they both loved. Preston vividly recalled the afternoon before, August 14th. He had brought his own kayak out to join them for the initial launch. The day had been bright, the sky a pale, hazy blue. Almost immediately after setting out, they had found a productive spot near a sandy embankment. Within an hour, both Odelia and Tanner had landed respectable largemouth bass. Preston remembered the pride radiating from them. He had insisted on documenting the moment, pulling out his phone. The resulting photograph captured them standing on the shore, grinning broadly. Tanner, wearing a vibrant royal blue t-shirt and patterned swim trunks, had his light blue polo cap turned backward. Odelia, her long blonde hair catching the sun, wore a hot pink sleeveless top and dark leggings. They held the fish up toward the camera, the quintessential image of a successful summer outing. Shortly after taking the photo, around 4 p.m., Preston had bid them farewell. They were equipped with camping gear, supplies for a campfire dinner, intending to cook the fish they caught, and crucially, a satellite emergency beacon, a standard precaution for remote excursions. He left them to paddle toward their favorite secluded campsite, the plan firm for the next morning's pickup. Now, hours overdue, the silence at the boat launch felt wrong. The initial annoyance of waiting had curdled into a tight knot of anxiety. They knew these waters. They were experienced kayakers. They wouldn't simply be late without attempting to make contact. Deciding he could no longer wait passively, Preston unloaded his own kayak from his truck and pushed off into the water. He began the familiar paddle toward the campsite they always used, a small clearing accessible only by water. The journey took nearly 40 minutes. As he rounded the final bend, he scanned the shoreline, expecting to see the bright colors of their kayaks pulled up onto the bank. He found the campsite, but it was eerily incomplete. The tent was erected, standing slightly askew. Near a fire pit, which was stone cold and appeared unused since the previous evening, some basic gear was scattered: a cooler, a tackle box, a dry bag with some clothes. But the siblings were gone. More alarmingly, their 2 kayaks were missing. The scene suggested they had set up camp and then, for some unknown reason, returned to the water. There was no note, no sign of distress, just an unsettling absence. Preston circled the area, calling their names until his voice grew hoarse. The marshland absorbed the sound, offering nothing in return. The sense of wrongness intensified. Why would they leave their campsite in the middle of the night or early morning? Why take the kayaks but leave other essential gear behind? Returning to the boat launch, his movements now frantic, Preston drove until he found a reliable cell signal. He contacted the local sheriff's office. A missing persons report was officially filed for Odelia and Tanner Keegan. Given the environment and the circumstances, the initial operating theory among the first responders was tragically straightforward. The siblings had likely encountered trouble on the water during the night and accidentally drowned. The immediate response was rapid and comprehensive. The disappearance of two young adults in the vast, unforgiving environment of the Louisiana marshes triggered a multi-agency search operation. Local law enforcement coordinated with the U.S. Coast Guard, the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries, and a growing contingent of volunteers. The search zone was immense, encompassing miles of interconnected bayous, canals, lakes, and dense wetlands. The environment itself was the primary obstacle. The water was murky, visibility often reduced to inches. The shorelines were dense with reedy grasses and cypress swamps, making ground searches slow and perilous. Airboats skimmed the surface, their massive fans roaring through the silence, while helicopters crisscrossed the area from above. Sonar equipment was deployed in the deeper channels, attempting to peer beneath the opaque surface. For the first 48 hours, the search focused on the area between the campsite and the boat launch, operating under the assumption that Odelia and Tanner had attempted to return but encountered an accident. Preston Keegan was relentless, participating in the search, providing detailed knowledge of the areas his children frequented. The prevailing theory that they had simply drowned didn't sit right with him. They were strong swimmers, cautious kayakers. While accidents happened, the absence of any debris, any floating gear, or the kayaks themselves was puzzling. If a kayak capsized, gear usually broke free and floated. On the third day of the search, August 18th, a breakthrough occurred, but it didn't clarify the situation. It fractured it. A wildlife and fisheries airboat located Tanner's kayak. It was found drifting in a main waterway several miles from the campsite. The kayak was capsized, and some minor scuff marks were visible on the hull. This discovery seemed to confirm the investigators' worst fears. It was the classic signature of a boating accident. The focus intensified around this location, with dive teams brought in to search the bottom for the siblings, the operation shifting grimly from rescue to recovery. However, just hours later, a second discovery fundamentally altered the trajectory of the investigation. Odelia's kayak was found, but its location and condition made no sense in the context of an accident. It was discovered nearly 5 miles away from Tanner's kayak, near the entrance of a restricted industrial access canal. Unlike Tanner's, Odelia's kayak was upright, undamaged, and appeared to have been deliberately pulled close to the bank near a service road. The separation of the kayaks presented an immediate, confounding problem. If they had been together when an accident occurred, the kayaks should have been found in relatively close proximity, subject to the same currents and winds. The distance between them suggested they had separated voluntarily or had been separated by force. Furthermore, the location of Odelia's kayak was highly unusual. The industrial canal serviced a large, sprawling logistics and petrochemical support facility owned by Zeller Industrial Solutions. It was a private, heavily secured area, not a place recreational kayakers would typically venture, especially not at night. The facility operated 24 hours a day, providing support for offshore oil rigs and managing significant maritime traffic. The discovery immediately shifted the focus of the investigation. The theory of a simple accident could no longer account for the evidence. Investigators began to question why Odelia's kayak was there. Had they sought help at the facility? Had they stumbled upon something they weren't supposed to see? Detectives arrived at the Zeller Industrial Solutions facility, expecting cooperation. The facility was a major employer in the region, and its management typically maintained a cooperative relationship with local authorities. However, the investigation into the Keegan disappearance encountered immediate and unexpected resistance. When detectives requested access to the security logs for the night of August 14th and the early morning of August 15th, they were met by the facility's head of security, who politely but firmly explained that the data for that specific time frame had been corrupted due to a system glitch during a routine update. This explanation was met with intense skepticism by the detectives. When they requested CCTV footage covering the canal entrance and the service road where the kayak was found, the response was equally frustrating. They were informed that the coverage in that specific sector was minimal, and the few cameras present were either malfunctioning or pointed in the wrong direction that night. The resistance was polished but impenetrable. Zeller Industrial Solutions, through its corporate representatives and legal counsel, stonewalled attempts to interview employees who were on shift that night without a company lawyer present. The interviews that did take place were brief and yielded nothing. Employees claimed to have seen nothing unusual, their answers rehearsed and uniform. The investigation hit a wall. The physical evidence pointed toward the facility, but the corporate infrastructure blocked any further inquiry. Without probable cause for a warrant, which the presence of the kayak alone did not provide, they could not force access. With the industrial lead stalled, investigators were forced to look elsewhere. They needed a plausible alternative theory that could explain the disappearance and the separated kayaks. Attention turned to the localized tensions within the commercial fishing community in the area. The marshlands were not just a recreational area, they were a vital economic resource. Investigators learned of an ongoing, sometimes violent, jurisdictional dispute between two competing commercial fishing operations. Reports indicated that these groups were known for aggressively protecting their territories, sometimes resulting in confrontations, sabotage of equipment, like cut lines or damaged traps, and threats of violence. A new theory emerged. Perhaps Odelia and Tanner, kayaking at night, had inadvertently paddled into an area where one of these operations was taking place. They might have been mistaken for rivals, or perhaps they witnessed an illegal activity, such as poaching or sabotage. This theory gained traction because it provided a motive for foul play in a remote area where conflicts often went unreported. For several weeks, the investigation focused heavily on this angle. Detectives interviewed known members of the competing fishing operations, scrutinized their activities, and looked for any sign of involvement. The investigation consumed significant resources, driven by the need for answers in the face of growing community pressure. However, despite the thoroughness of the inquiry, no connection could be established between the fishing disputes and the Keegan siblings. The individuals involved had verifiable alibis, and no physical evidence linked them to the disappearance. The fishing dispute eventually dissipated, leaving the investigation back at square one. The initial urgency faded. The massive search operation was scaled back. The physical trail, exposed to the harsh Louisiana climate and the constant movement of the tides, had been erased. Months passed, turning into a year. The case of Odelia and Tanner Keegan went cold. Preston Keegan refused to accept the stalemate. While the official investigation languished, his own obsession grew. He remained convinced that the answers lay behind the gates of the Zeller Industrial Solutions facility. He repeatedly voiced his suspicions to the local sheriff's office, demanding they apply more pressure, secure warrants, and investigate the suspicious corruption of the security logs. But his pleas were largely dismissed, characterized as the desperate attempts of a grieving father unable to accept the probability of a tragic accident, despite the glaring anomalies surrounding Odelia's kayak. The authorities had moved on. By September 2019, 7 years had passed since Odelia and Tanner Keegan vanished into the Louisiana marshes. The case had become a local tragedy, a painful memory occasionally resurrected by anniversary news segments, but otherwise dormant. The investigation had long since been filed away, categorized as a cold case with no viable leads. Preston Keegan continued his solitary vigil, but the world had largely forgotten the two smiling young adults holding up their catch. The breakthrough, when it came, did not originate from a dredged-up memory or a newly discovered piece of evidence in the bayou. It came from the silence of the deep ocean. It began with an automated alert at the GEOS International Emergency Response Coordination Center, IERCC, a global hub responsible for monitoring satellite distress signals. In the early hours of September 10, 2019, a signal flared on their monitoring systems. It was a distinct SOS transmission, indicating an emergency situation requiring immediate response. The IERCC staff analyzed the signal, isolating the coordinates. The location was startling. The ping originated not from the coastal marshes where the Keegans had disappeared, but from a remote location deep in the Gulf of Mexico, hundreds of miles off the coast of Louisiana. The area was characterized by open ocean, far from any established shipping lanes, where the water depth exceeded 4,000 feet. The digital map showed the alert icon blinking over the vast blue expanse, signaling an emergency in the middle of nowhere. The alert was immediately relayed to the U.S. Coast Guard Sector New Orleans, the authority responsible for maritime search and rescue operations in that region. The information was prioritized, an active SOS signal in the deep Gulf. Simultaneously, the IERCC analysts worked to identify the source of the signal. Every satellite emergency beacon transmits a unique identifier, a hex ID, which is registered to the owner. They cross-referenced the hex ID from the active signal with their global database. The match was instantaneous, and the result was baffling. The signal was coming from the satellite messenger registered to the Keegan family, the device Odelia and Tanner had carried with them 7 years prior. The implications were staggering. How could a device lost in the shallow waters of the Louisiana Bayou in 2012 suddenly activate in the middle of the deep ocean in 2019? It defied logic. The possibility that the siblings had somehow survived, drifted out to sea, and remained alive for 7 years was impossible. Kayaks were not built for the open ocean, and they carried supplies for only 1 night. The Coast Guard response was immediate and urgent. Despite the bizarre circumstances, an active SOS signal demanded action. A cutter and a long-range search aircraft were dispatched to the coordinates. The mobilization was swift, driven by the possibility, however remote, that someone was in distress. The aircraft arrived on the scene first, sweeping the area with advanced sensors and visual observation. The weather was clear, the sea relatively calm. They found nothing. The vast expanse of the Gulf of Mexico was empty. There was no vessel, no debris field, no life raft. The cutter arrived hours later, conducting a detailed search pattern around the coordinates. They deployed specialized equipment, listening for any sign of human activity or a submerged object. Again, nothing. The mystery deepened when the analysts at the IERCC reviewed the transmission data. The signal had not been continuous. It had activated suddenly, transmitted the SOS burst for approximately 90 seconds, and then gone silent. The abrupt cessation of the signal was as mysterious as its activation. The discovery sent shockwaves through the cold case unit. The physical evidence, the satellite beacon, had resurfaced in an impossible location. The ghost signal raised a host of agonizing questions. Had the device been adrift for 7 years, finally succumbing to the elements, triggering a false alarm? That seemed highly unlikely, given the specific nature of the SOS transmission, which usually required manual activation. The more plausible and more disturbing interpretation was that someone had been in possession of the device and had transported it to the deep Gulf. The brief transmission suggested an accidental activation, or perhaps a deliberate but quickly aborted attempt to signal for help. The accident theory, long the favored explanation for the disappearance, was now definitively discarded. The ping confirmed what Preston Keegan had believed for 7 years. Something deliberate, something sinister, had happened to his children. The investigation was reignited, but the focus was no longer the murky waters of the marshes. It was the vast, concealing depths of the Gulf of Mexico and the unknown mechanism that had transported the evidence there. The case was no longer just a local mystery. The maritime location and the passage of time brought federal agencies into the fold. the investigation had a new beginning, triggered by a signal from the past. The ghost signal from the Gulf of Mexico didn't just reopen the Keegan case, it transformed it. What had been a localized missing persons investigation, hampered by jurisdictional limits and a lack of evidence, was now a complex federal inquiry involving the FBI, the Coast Guard Investigative Service, CGIS, and specialized maritime forensic units. The central question was no longer what happened in the bayou, but how the evidence ended up in the deep ocean 7 years later. Investigators knew they had to start at the beginning, reevaluating every assumption made in 2012. This meant returning to the one person who had never stopped investigating, Preston Keegan. When federal agents arrived at Preston's home in late September 2019, they found a man consumed by the disappearance. The intervening 7 years had hardened him. The initial frantic energy had been replaced by a methodical, obsessive focus. They expected to find a grieving father clinging to theories. What they found instead was a shadow investigation far more detailed than the original case file. Preston had never accepted the dismissal of the Zeller Industrial Solutions connection. The location of Odelia's kayak near the restricted canal, the conveniently corrupted security logs, the corporate stonewalling, it all pointed to a cover-up. While the official investigation had turned toward the fishing disputes and eventually withered, Preston had focused exclusively on Zeller. He led the investigators to a back room in his house, which had been converted into an operations center. The walls were covered with maps of the marshlands, nautical charts of the Gulf, and photographs of the Zeller facility taken from a distance with a long-range lens. But the core of his investigation was contained in a series of binders, meticulously organized and cross-referenced. Preston presented his findings. He had spent thousands of hours monitoring the Zeller facility, observing the maritime traffic coming and going from their docks. He explained that the facility's stated operations involved servicing offshore oil rigs requiring a steady stream of offshore supply vessels, OSVs. However, Preston had documented a pattern of activity that didn't align with this legitimate business. He detailed late-night movements of specific vessels, arriving and departing under the cover of darkness, often between midnight and 4 a.m. He had logged dates, times, vessel profiles, and names. He noted that these vessels often deviated from the established shipping lanes, their movements seemingly designed to avoid scrutiny. He pointed out specific OSVs that appeared frequently, their transponders sometimes deactivated during these nocturnal operations, a significant violation of maritime regulations. Preston was convinced that the Zeller facility was a nexus for illicit activities. He suspected smuggling, perhaps drugs or weapons, utilizing the legitimate maritime traffic as cover. He believed his children had inadvertently stumbled upon this operation and had been silenced. The investigators were stunned by the sheer volume and detail of Preston's logs. What had previously been viewed by local authorities as the obsession of a grieving father was now a critical data set. It provided a 7-year history of suspicious activity originating from the exact location where the physical evidence had suggested the investigation should focus in 2012. Preston also detailed the resistance he had encountered. He recounted how he had repeatedly attempted to present his findings to the local sheriff's office, only to be aggressively dismissed. He described how Zeller security had harassed him, threatening him with trespassing charges when he observed the facility from public waterways. But the most disturbing aspect of his account was the behavior of local law enforcement. He specifically mentioned a Deputy Myron Blevins. According to Preston, Blevins had been particularly hostile to his inquiries. Blevins had been involved in the initial investigation and had been instrumental in dismissing the Zeller connection, pushing the accident theory and the fishing dispute angle. Preston described instances where Blevins seemed actively protective of Zeller interests, intervening to shut down any line of inquiry that pointed toward the facility. Preston recounted a specific incident in 2014 when he had obtained photographs of a suspicious vessel docked at the Zeller facility late at night, loading unmarked containers. He presented the photos to the sheriff's office, demanding action. Deputy Blevins had taken the report, assuring Preston it would be investigated. Weeks later, when Preston followed up, Blevins claimed the photos were inconclusive and the vessel was legitimate. Preston later discovered the vessel had left the area shortly after he filed the report, and Blevins had never initiated a formal inquiry. Preston believed Blevins was compromised, actively working to protect Zeller Industrial Solutions. At the time, this accusation had been dismissed as paranoia. Now, in the context of the resurfaced evidence and the clear indication of a long-term criminal enterprise, Preston's claims gained chilling credibility. The federal investigators recognized the significance of Preston's shadow investigation. It provided the context they needed to understand the scope of the potential criminal activity. The logs confirmed a pattern of organized deep-water maritime activity originating from the Zeller facility. If these vessels were involved in smuggling, they were also the most likely mechanism for transporting the evidence to the deep Gulf. The investigation shifted focus. The target was now Zeller Industrial Solutions, and the immediate priority was to corroborate Preston's findings with hard data. They needed to identify the vessels involved, trace their movements, and determine the nature of their illicit operations. They also needed to initiate a confidential investigation into Deputy Myron Blevins, recognizing that any investigation into Zeller would likely be compromised if local corruption was involved. The shadow investigation had illuminated the path forward, pointing toward a conspiracy far deeper and more organized than previously imagined. Armed with Preston Keegan's meticulous logs and the precise coordinates of the SOS ping, the investigation entered a new, highly technical phase. The task force, now comprising federal agents and maritime forensic specialists, focused on identifying the vessel responsible for transporting the satellite beacon to the deep Gulf. They knew that if they could identify the vessel, they could begin to unravel the conspiracy. The primary tool for this phase of the investigation was the Automatic Identification System, AIS, a global network that tracks the movement of maritime vessels. All large commercial vessels are required to broadcast their position, course, and speed using AIS transponders. The historical AIS data for the Gulf of Mexico provided a detailed record of maritime traffic around the time of the SOS ping on September 10, 2019. The investigators began a painstaking process of analyzing the AIS data for the hours surrounding the signal. The search area was vast, and the volume of data was immense, reflecting the constant movement of commercial traffic in the Gulf. They were looking for anomalies, vessels exhibiting unusual behavior consistent with the disposal of evidence. This meant looking for vessels that deviated from established shipping lanes, slowed significantly, or stopped in the area of the ping. The analysis required sophisticated software and expert interpretation. The team meticulously filtered the data, eliminating vessels that maintained a consistent course and speed or were clearly engaged in legitimate activities such as fishing or surveying. They focused on the specific coordinates where the signal originated, looking for any vessel that intersected with that location at the precise time of the transmission. The process took weeks of detailed analysis. The deep Gulf was a busy area, and several vessels were in the vicinity. However, one vessel immediately stood out. It was an offshore supply vessel, OSV, named the Iron Current. The AIS data showed the Iron Current had departed from the vicinity of the Zeller Industrial Solutions facility in the early hours of September 9th. Its stated destination was an offshore oil rig located further west in the Gulf. However, the data revealed a significant deviation from its expected course. In the early hours of September 10th, around the time the SOS signal was transmitted, the Iron Current slowed dramatically. The data showed the vessel decelerating from its cruising speed of 12 knots to a near standstill. It remained at the exact coordinates of the SOS ping for approximately 10 minutes, drifting slowly before resuming speed and correcting its course toward its stated destination. The behavior was highly suspicious and difficult to explain through legitimate maritime operations. There was no operational reason for an OSV to stop in the middle of the deep ocean, far from any infrastructure. The duration of the stop was consistent with the time required to dispose of an object overboard. The correlation between the vessel's location and the timing of the 90-second ping was too precise to be a coincidence. The investigators immediately cross-referenced the Iron Current with Preston Keegan's logs. The vessel appeared frequently in his documentation of suspicious activity at the Zeller docks. Preston had noted the Iron Current engaging in late-night departures, often with its transponder deactivated for periods of time near the coast. It was one of the vessels he had identified as likely involved in the illicit operations he observed. The evidence strongly suggested that the Iron Current was the vessel they were looking for. The next step was to determine who controlled it. Tracing the ownership of commercial vessels can be a complex endeavor. Vessels are often registered through a web of shell corporations and flags of convenience, designed to obscure the true ownership and limit liability. The Iron Current was no exception. The vessel was registered in Panama, owned by a holding company based in the Cayman Islands. This holding company was, in turn, owned by a series of interlocking shell corporations registered in various jurisdictions known for financial secrecy. The investigators spent weeks peeling back the layers of corporate obfuscation, utilizing international cooperation agreements and forensic accounting techniques to follow the money trail. The trail eventually led back to the United States. The ultimate beneficial ownership of the Iron Current was traced to interests controlled by Zeller Industrial Solutions, and specifically to its owner, the influential and politically connected Gideon Zeller. Gideon Zeller was a prominent figure in the region, known for his wealth, his political donations, and his ruthless business practices. His company controlled significant infrastructure along the Gulf Coast, and he wielded considerable influence over local politics and law enforcement. The connection explained the resistance Preston Keegan had encountered and the stonewalling of the initial investigation, particularly the actions of Deputy Blevins. The identification of the Iron Current and its connection to Gideon Zeller solidified the investigation's working theory. The evidence indicated a large-scale criminal enterprise operating under the cover of legitimate business, utilizing the infrastructure of Zeller Industrial Solutions and the maritime assets like the Iron Current. The disposal theory was now firmly established. Investigators believed that the Iron Current had been used to dispose of the Keegan siblings' belongings, likely in an attempt to permanently erase any remaining evidence of the crime. The activation of the satellite beacon had been an accident, a mistake that had exposed the entire operation. The investigation now had a clear target: the Iron Current, its crew, and the broader Zeller organization. The task force began planning the next phase of the operation, recognizing that they were dealing with a sophisticated, well-resourced, and dangerous adversary. They needed to move carefully, gathering enough evidence to dismantle the entire organization while operating under the assumption that Zeller was aware of the renewed scrutiny. As the Joint Federal Task Force, now heavily involving the FBI and the DEA, alongside the Coast Guard Investigative Service, began to probe the intricate operations of Zeller Industrial Solutions, the scope of the criminal enterprise came into sharp focus. It was clear they were dealing with more than just smuggling. The infrastructure, the logistics, and the extreme measures taken to maintain secrecy suggested a sophisticated operation involving narcotics and, increasingly suspected, human trafficking. The resistance they encountered mirrored Preston Keegan's experiences, confirming the deeply entrenched corruption that had shielded Gideon Zeller for years. A confidential internal review by the Department of Justice confirmed the suspicions surrounding Deputy Myron Blevins. Financial records revealed unexplained wealth and direct, albeit disguised, payments from Gideon Zeller. It became evident that Blevins had actively suppressed the 2012 investigation, ensuring that any inquiry pointing toward Zeller was quickly neutralized. Recognizing that the local jurisdiction was compromised, the task force established a secure operational base outside the area, ensuring the integrity of the investigation and protecting their personnel. The immediate focus was the Iron Current. Investigators identified the vessel's captain, Jarek Russo, as a critical figure. Russo had been the captain of the Iron Current for nearly a decade, overseeing its operations and reporting directly to Zeller's top lieutenants. He was deeply involved in the illicit activities, possessing intimate knowledge of the organization's structure, methods, and history. He was also the one responsible for the evidence disposal in the Gulf. Instead of moving directly on Russo, the task force opted for a strategy of disruption and psychological pressure. They understood that a direct confrontation might lead to the destruction of evidence and the activation of the organization's defenses, potentially including violence against witnesses. They needed to isolate Russo, make him feel vulnerable, and force him to see cooperation as his only means of survival. The surveillance operation was intense and multifaceted. The Iron Current was tracked continuously via AIS data and satellite imagery. When the vessel docked at various ports along the Gulf Coast, surveillance teams were deployed to monitor the crew's activities, the loading and unloading of cargo, and any interactions with Zeller representatives. The pressure campaign began subtly but escalated quickly. The Iron Current found itself subjected to relentless scrutiny from port authorities. Routine inspections became more frequent and significantly more thorough. The Coast Guard boarded the vessel multiple times, citing minor safety violations, causing costly delays and disrupting the vessel's tight schedule. Customs and Border Protection agents conducted surprise audits of the vessel's manifest and cargo, questioning discrepancies and increasing the operational risk for the organization. These disruptions were carefully orchestrated to appear as heightened regulatory enforcement, but their cumulative effect was significant. The Iron Current began missing deadlines, its operations became inefficient, and the organization's revenue stream was impacted. The pressure began to mount on Jarek Russo. Gideon Zeller was not known for tolerating failure. The task force utilized electronic surveillance, intercepting communications indicating that Zeller was increasingly dissatisfied with the performance of the Iron Current and furious about the increased attention from authorities. The botched evidence disposal, the SOS ping that had reignited the Keegan investigation, was a catastrophic liability, and Zeller held Russo personally responsible. Russo began to feel the heat from both sides. He was being squeezed by the authorities and simultaneously facing the wrath of his employer. The surveillance teams noted a distinct change in his behavior. He became agitated, paranoid, constantly checking his surroundings. He started using burner phones, minimizing his time ashore, and exhibiting the behavior of a man who knew he was being hunted. The task force intensified the pressure. They approached some of the junior crew members of the Iron Current, conducting interviews, suggesting they knew about the illicit activities and offering leniency in exchange for cooperation. This information quickly filtered back to Russo, amplifying his paranoia. He believed the organization was setting him up, positioning him as the fall guy for their failures, and that his elimination was imminent. The breaking point came in early 2020. The Iron Current docked in Galveston, Texas, for scheduled maintenance. The surveillance team noted that Russo was unusually tense. He had a heated argument with a Zeller representative on the dock, the exchange visibly aggressive. The representative left abruptly, and Russo returned to the vessel, his face pale. Later that evening, Russo made a desperate move. Believing that the organization was planning to silence him permanently, he panicked. He abandoned the Iron Current outside of his scheduled leave, taking a small pre-packed bag and disappearing into the streets of Galveston. The surveillance team tracked him as he took a taxi to a local budget motel. He checked in under a false name, paying cash. The task force recognized the signs of a fugitive preparing to flee. They needed to apprehend him before he disappeared permanently or was reached by Zeller's operatives. The next morning, Russo emerged from the motel, his appearance altered, wearing sunglasses and a baseball cap. He took another taxi, this time heading north, toward the George Bush Intercontinental Airport in Houston. The chase was on, The task force mobilized rapidly, coordinating with airport police and federal agents stationed at the airport. They tracked the taxi's progress along the highway, ensuring they had teams in place to intercept Russo when he arrived. The tension was palpable. They knew this was their best chance to break the case wide open. Russo arrived at the international terminal, his movements hurried and erratic. He proceeded directly to the check-in counter for a flight bound for South America, utilizing a sophisticated false passport. The agents observed him from a distance, waiting for the optimal moment to move in. They couldn't risk a confrontation in a crowded terminal that might escalate or allow Russo to escape into the secure area of the airport. Russo cleared security and proceeded toward the gate. The departure lounge was crowded, the atmosphere filled with the ambient noise of travelers. The agents positioned themselves strategically, blocking the exits and blending in with the crowd. They monitored the flight status. Boarding was scheduled to begin in 15 minutes. As the boarding process began, Russo lined up, clutching his bag, his eyes darting nervously. He was moments away from escaping U.S. jurisdiction. The lead agent gave the signal. The team converged on Russo simultaneously from multiple directions. The apprehension was swift and decisive. Russo was taken down before he had a chance to react, his face pressed against the cool terrazzo floor of the terminal. He was handcuffed and escorted away from the crowded gate, the other passengers staring in stunned silence. Jarek Russo was in custody. The defection had been intercepted. The task force now had the key witness they needed to dismantle the Zeller organization and finally uncover the truth about what happened to Odelia and Tanner Keegan. The years of investigation, the frustration, the technological breakthroughs, it had all led to this moment. The interrogation of Jarek Russo would reveal the dark secrets hidden behind the corporate facade of Zeller Industrial Solutions. Jarek Russo was transported to a secure federal facility. The interrogation began immediately. He was isolated, disoriented, and consumed by terror. He understood the reach of Gideon Zeller's organization, the violence they inflicted on those who betrayed them. He also understood the weight of the evidence against him, the AIS data proving his presence at the disposal site, the surveillance documenting his flight, the inevitable charges stemming from his long involvement in the organization. He was facing the rest of his life in prison or a violent death at the hands of his former employer. The federal prosecutors presented him with a stark choice: cooperate fully or face the full force of the federal justice system, which offered little protection against the organization's reach within the prison system. Russo, seeing no other viable option for survival, demanded a deal. He insisted on entry into the Federal Witness Protection Program, guaranteeing his safety in exchange for a full confession and testimony against Gideon Zeller and the organization. The prosecutors, recognizing the value of his testimony in dismantling a major criminal enterprise responsible for murder and international trafficking, agreed to the terms. Over the course of several days, Jarek Russo detailed the inner workings of the Zeller organization, confirming the investigators' suspicions of large-scale smuggling and human trafficking. And finally, he recounted the events of the night of August 14, 2012. Russo confessed that he and a specialized team were engaged in a highly sensitive, illicit operation that night. The Zeller organization was locked in a fierce rivalry with a competing smuggling and trafficking syndicate that operated in the same region. This rival organization utilized an underwater pipeline near the Zeller facility to transport illicit substances. Gideon Zeller, determined to cripple his competitors' operations and send a message of dominance, had ordered Russo and his team to sabotage the pipeline. The operation was complex and required specialized equipment. They were working underwater, using scuba gear and underwater cutting tools, operating from a small vessel anchored in the restricted canal near the Zeller facility. The location was chosen for its seclusion and proximity to the target pipeline. They believed the area was secure, protected by their own security and the corrupted oversight of Deputy Blevins. It was late at night, the darkness providing cover for their activities. They were focused on their task, the noise of their equipment masking any ambient sounds. They never anticipated recreational kayakers in that area. Odelia and Tanner Keegan, exploring the canals late at night, perhaps drawn by curiosity or simply navigating the complex waterways, had inadvertently stumbled upon the operation. They saw the vessel, the lights, the activity on the water. They had become witnesses to a federal crime, an act of industrial sabotage linked to organized crime. Russo's team spotted them immediately. The reaction was swift and decisive. They couldn't risk exposure. They intercepted the kayaks, capturing the siblings before they had a chance to escape or call for help. They were pulled from their kayaks, restrained, and taken back to the Zeller facility, held in a secure warehouse. The situation escalated rapidly. Gideon Zeller was informed of the capture. He arrived at the facility shortly after, assessing the situation. His decision was cold and calculated, devoid of hesitation. According to Russo, Zeller viewed Tanner as an immediate liability. He was young, aggressive, and protective of his sister, deemed likely to resist and difficult to control. Zeller ordered him executed immediately. Russo revealed the horrific details, describing how Tanner was taken to a remote, heavily wooded area on Zeller's extensive private property inland and murdered. They buried his body in an unmarked grave, deep within the dense woods, far from the marshlands where the search would be focused. Odelia's fate was different, and perhaps even more horrific. Zeller saw the 21-year-old woman not as a liability, but as an asset. The Zeller organization had extensive connections with international human trafficking networks. Instead of killing her, Zeller ordered her sold into the sex trade. Russo stated that Odelia was held at the facility for several days, undergoing a brutal process of subjugation before being transferred to a vessel bound for an international destination. She was absorbed into the trafficking network, disappearing into a shadowy world of exploitation and abuse. Russo claimed he did not know her current location or whether she was still alive. The organization compartmentalized information. His role was operational, and the human cargo was handled by a different division. With the siblings dealt with, the organization moved to cover their tracks. Russo described how they staged the scene to confuse the investigation. They took the kayaks and disposed of them in different locations. Tanner's kayak was capsized and set adrift in the main waterway, suggesting an accident. Odelia's kayak was left near the canal entrance, a deliberate misdirection designed to create confusion, knowing that Blevins would ensure the lead was not aggressively pursued. The cover-up was comprehensive. The corrupted security logs, the malfunctioning CCTV cameras, it was all orchestrated to protect the organization and its operations. The siblings' belongings, including the satellite beacon, were kept at the facility, locked away in a secure storage area. They remained there for 7 years, a forgotten liability, until Zeller decided to eliminate all remaining loose ends. Finally, Russo explained the 2019 SOS ping. Gideon Zeller, perhaps feeling the pressure from increased scrutiny on his operations or simply conducting a routine cleanup of past liabilities, ordered Russo to dispose of the belongings permanently. Russo was tasked with taking the items far offshore, weighting them down, and dumping them in the deep ocean. Russo took the Iron Current out to the deep Gulf, the AIS data corroborating his account of the vessel's movements. He placed the belongings in a heavy canvas bag, weighting it with chains. He insisted that the activation of the satellite beacon was an accident. He described how he aggressively handled the bag just before throwing it overboard, perhaps inadvertently pressing the SOS button during the struggle to lift the heavy bag over the railing. The signal transmitted for 90 seconds before the bag sank into the depths, the water pressure likely destroying the device or cutting off the transmission. The confession was comprehensive and devastating. It provided the answers that Preston Keegan had sought for 7 years, confirming his darkest fears about the Zeller organization and the corruption that protected it. But the truth was more horrific than anyone had imagined: a conspiracy of murder, corruption, and human trafficking, hidden behind the facade of a legitimate corporation. The investigation now moved toward its final phase, recovering the remains of Tanner Keegan, dismantling the Zeller organization, and confronting the agonizing reality of Odelia's fate. Armed with Jarek Russo's detailed confession, the Joint Task Force moved swiftly. In late 2020, investigators executed a search warrant on the vast private property owned by Gideon Zeller. Following Russo's precise directions to the remote wooded area, excavation teams began the grim task of searching for the unmarked grave. After several days of intensive effort, they located the site. Skeletal remains were carefully unearthed. DNA analysis confirmed the remains belonged to Tanner Keegan. After more than 8 years, the young man's fate was definitively known, and his remains could be returned to his father. Simultaneously, the task force executed large-scale raids on the Zeller Industrial Solutions facilities and the organization's known operational centers. The operation was massive, involving hundreds of federal agents and tactical teams. Gideon Zeller, Deputy Myron Blevins, and several high-ranking members of the organization were arrested. They were indicted on a litany of charges, including conspiracy, kidnapping, murder, corruption, racketeering, and human trafficking. During the raids, evidence of the extensive criminal enterprise was seized, and crucially, several victims of the trafficking network were rescued from captivity at various locations controlled by the organization. The investigation into the international trafficking network continued into 2021. The task force focused on analyzing the encrypted servers seized during the raids, hoping to find any trace of Odelia Keegan. The analysis revealed the horrific scope of the operation. It confirmed that Odelia had been moved internationally shortly after her abduction in 2012. The digital trail indicated she had been trafficked through several countries over the years. Devastatingly, the evidence confirmed she was last known to be alive within the network as recently as late 2020, located somewhere in Southeast Asia. For Preston Keegan, the resolution of the case brought a fractured closure. The recovery of Tanner's remains allowed him to finally lay his son to rest. The dismantling of the Zeller organization and the arrests of those responsible provided a measure of justice. But this was overshadowed by the agonizing knowledge that his daughter was likely still alive, captive in the horrific world of international sex trafficking, with little hope of recovery. The celebration of her mobility had ended in captivity, a continuing tragedy hidden in the shadows of the world.